About 2.5 years ago, I was in a graduate course here at Yale on the war in Afghanistan that was set up in the aftermath of the US withdrawal in August 2021. And as I began to do the readings for the course over the first few weeks, I began to have this nagging feeling in the back of my head that there was a character missing from this story. In accounts of previous American wars I had read, the US Congress was either a powerful ally or a formidable opponent. But in accounts of the war in Afghanistan, it was barely a character at all. At most, it was a footnote, and I couldn't figure out why. So I called up a guy named Kyle Wilkins. I'd worked with Kyle when I was a congressional staffer during my gap year back home in Kansas City. And when in his earlier days as a staffer on the Hill, Kyle had worked for the House Armed Services Committee, which oversees the military. And he'd worked there during the first decade of the war in Afghanistan, which means Kyle had been on congressional delegation trips to Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd been immersed in this world of defense spending on Capitol Hill. And I called up Kyle and I said, Kyle, what do you think? What was the role of Congress in the war in Afghanistan? And Kyle said, I don't know, but it would be interesting to find out. And that is what I've been doing for the past 2.5 years. So this question, what was the role of Congress in the war in Afghanistan? It's a deceptive question because it seems purely theoretical, and I promise you it's not. The US war in Afghanistan was the longest war in American history. The US spent more time fighting in Afghanistan than it did fighting in the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. It outlasted even the war in Vietnam. 20 years of war, more than 2,000 American service members killed, more than 70,000 civilians killed. The reason I think the question, what was the role of Congress in the war in Afghanistan, is such a powerful question is because I think it can help us begin to understand how on earth this war lasted for so long. So, what was the role of Congress in the war in Afghanistan? Well, it turns out the primary role that Congress played was as the funder of the war. Every single year, Congress has to fund the US government, the power of the purse, right? Congress has to fund the government every year. It also has to fund, therefore, the military every single year. That means that during a war, Congress has to fund the war every single year. So how does Congress fund war? Well, it happens in 2 steps. First, Congress has to raise the money, and then it has to give that money to the executive branch to spend. That's called appropriating the money. Let's go through these steps one by one. First, raising the money. Now, since the ratification of the US Constitution, every single war in American history has been funded, at least in part, with taxes. The first income tax in American history was created to help pay for the Civil War. During World War I, the tax rate for the top bracket of Americans went from 7% to 77%. During World War II, the number of people filing tax returns in America went from fewer than 8 million people to nearly 50 million people. Incidentally, it was during World War II that Irving Berlin wrote a song called "I Paid My Income Tax Today." During the Korean War, the top marginal tax rate in America went up to 92%. Taxes have always paid for large parts of American wars. They paid for about 21% of the Civil War, 22% of World War I, 40% of World War II, and nearly the entirety of the Korean War. Now, during the war in Vietnam, the Johnson administration actually resisted raising taxes because they understood that when you raise taxes to pay for a war, you thrust that war into a public debate, and they didn't want to have one of those. So, what happened during the war in Afghanistan? Well, during the war in Afghanistan, Congress didn't raise taxes. But it didn't just not raise taxes. It actually cut taxes. In 2002, and 2003, and 2008, and 2009, and 2010, and 2012, and 2017. Some of those tax cuts rank among the biggest in American history. This was the first war in our nation's entire past to be funded entirely through debt. Now, on debt, in previous American wars, American war debt was in large part owned by everyday Americans like you and me in the form of, in the Civil War, they were called 730s and 1020s. In the 20th century, we called them war bonds and liberty bonds. During the war in Afghanistan, the government sold us no such thing. Why does this matter? Why do I care about these things? Because in the absence of a draft, the connection between everyday Americans and soldiers overseas is a connection that we all carry around with us in our wallets. Without war taxes, without war bonds, we don't have to sacrifice for war as everyday Americans. War has become too easy for Americans. We can go through our lives without coming to terms with the fighting and the killing and the dying that is happening on our behalf halfway around the world. And that worries me. Part number 2, appropriating the money. This is giving the money to the executive branch to spend. Now, to understand this, you have to understand the difference between the way that Congress thinks about wildfires and hurricanes. Bear with me. So, when Congress is planning for disaster relief for the coming years, it knows that wildfires are going to hit the American West, so it plans for that. It budgets in advance for wildfires before they happen. But in 2003 and 2004, do you think Congress was budgeting in advance for Hurricane Katrina? Of course not. It couldn't have, right? So when something like that happens, when a once-in-a-generation or once-in-a-decade hurricane happens, Congress does not have enough money on hand to respond to it. So it has to pass an emergency spending bill. And the thing you have to understand about these emergency spending bills is that they don't get much oversight, because that's not the point of an emergency spending bill. The point is to get the money out the door as fast as possible to save as many lives as possible, right? So this is basically how America funds the outbreak of war. It's an unforeseen catastrophe like a hurricane. But the years after war, at least for the past 75 years or so, we treat it like a wildfire. It's a foreseen catastrophe. We can plan for it in advance. This is basically how we fund war. That right there, that's the Korean War. The orange line is the outbreak of war. It's an emergency spending bill. The blue is the base regular budget. After the war begins, we begin to fold the war budget into the regular budget. That's the Vietnam War. Basically the same concept. That right there is the Gulf War, the 1991 Gulf War, that it isn't labeled. But after 9/11, something really weird happens. That's 9/11. That's the invasion of Iraq. Then this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. That is how Congress funded the war in Afghanistan. Not like one 20-year war, but like 21-year surprise wars. So what's actually happening here? Well, for the first decade of the war, Congress did actually use hurricane bills. I call them emergency spending bills. The technical name for them, bear with me again, a mouthful, is emergency supplemental appropriations bills. I can barely say it. Now, I promise you again, this looks boring, but it's really important. Each one of these words has a lot of meaning behind it and can tell us why these bills got so little oversight. What does emergency mean? Congress has limits and caps on spending that it places on itself. And emergency spending does not count against those limits. And that makes sense for a hurricane or the outbreak of war. So when you pass emergency spending, basically, you're not really raising the deficit, even though you are raising the deficit. So politically, what this allowed Congress to do was to raise deficits to pay for the war in Afghanistan without appearing to raise deficits to pay for the war in Afghanistan, which was a political shield. It shielded the costs of the war from the American public. And thereby doing that, they also shielded the war from the American public. Supplemental. A regular appropriations bill, including defense bills, they take a year to pass. They get a whole year's worth of oversight on Capitol Hill. But these bills were passed off cycle. So they were passed in 100 days, or 80 days, or 50 days, or 30 days. That's a lot less time for Congress to figure out what's inside the bill. Now, again, that makes sense for a hurricane or the outbreak of war, but not when you're on year 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 of a war. Finally, appropriations. What that word signifies is that these bills evaded a lot of really important committees on Capitol Hill that usually have power over the defense budget. They usually have power to look inside and have oversight of the defense budget. And these bills, because they were appropriations bills, just went through 2 subcommittees, which means that instead of having 100+ staffers overseeing them, they had like 30. So basically, this system prevails in Congress for the war in Afghanistan for the first decade. Then in about 2008, a new president comes, Barack Obama is elected president, and Congress switches hands, and actually the government begins to try to fold the war budget into the regular budget. So in 2009 and 2010, they begin the process of folding the budget in. But then, in 2010, there is a midterm election in America, and the Democrats get absolutely hammered. It's what Barack Obama later called a shellacking. Enter the Tea Party. And the first big fight of the Tea Party Congress in 2011 was over the debt ceiling. And I will spare you all the details of that fight, but it was a months-long negotiation over the debt ceiling. And it ended dramatically in a compromise bill that was excitingly titled the Budget Control Act of 2011. I'm not lying. I wish I was lying. So that bill, the Budget Control Act of 2011, had two parts to it, basically. The first part was that it raised the debt ceiling. Second part was that it put caps on spending, new limits on government spending for the next decade. It also created a little bit of an exception, few things that wouldn't count against the caps. And one of those exceptions had a pretty curious term in it. It was overseas contingency operations, which was the Obama administration's term for the global war on terror. Funding for overseas contingency operations wouldn't count against the new budget caps. So in 2011, Congress stopped using emergency supplemental appropriations bills to fund the war in Afghanistan. And they began to use overseas contingency operations funding because it didn't count against the budget caps. They funded it through an account in the defense budget called the Overseas Contingency Operations Account, or the OCO account. Now, there are a couple of big problems with OCO besides the fact that they didn't really know what was inside OCO. Just like with the SUPs, there wasn't much oversight. There were two other really big problems with it. The first is that once OCO funding was passed, that funding got absorbed into the regular budget, into all these different accounts, and Congress really couldn't tell how it was being spent at the end of the day. They couldn't really tell if it was actually being spent on war costs, which is what it was designed for. Second big problem with it, and this is why it was eventually called by many on Capitol Hill a slush fund, is because OCO was used to pay for all sorts of things that were not overseas contingency operations. By about 2016, the White House and the Pentagon began to send defense budget requests to Congress that put OCO into three categories. The first category was regular OCO, immediate red flag, when one of the categories of OCO was regular OCO. The second, that means it's direct war costs, direct war spending. The second part was called enduring OCO. That means we need this right now for the war, but we'll still need it when the war is over. The third part was called OCO for base. Bear in mind, the whole point of OCO was that it was non-base funding. So what was OCO for base? OCO for base was funding the Department of Defense admitted should be in the base budget. It was not a war need, but they couldn't fit it in the base budget because of the budget caps they had set on themselves. So they put it in the OCO budget, which had all these exceptions and a lack of oversight because it's supposed to be for immediate war needs. By the end of the war in Afghanistan, Congress had appropriated about $2.3 trillion in emergency and contingency war funding for the war in Afghanistan. By the time the last flight of US soldiers left Kabul in August 2021, 20 years of war had been funded totally off the books. Why does this matter? Why should we care about this? Now, this system seemed to work really well for everybody. Congressional Democrats were spared the challenge they were soft on defense. Congressional Republicans were able to raise deficits, which is not really what they're supposed to do. The military was able to get funding for new programs without having to make any cuts to its regular budget. And 3 consecutive American presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, were able to avoid being the president that lost the war. But without Congress doing its job, without good oversight and war taxes, we Americans didn't really feel or see or discuss the war. And those presidents became completely unchecked. Why is it a problem when presidents are unchecked in war, when our government is unchecked in war? Because without good oversight, it becomes easier to fund and prolong programs that are wasteful and unsuccessful, right? It also becomes easier and easier to fund and prolong conflicts that are wasteful and unsuccessful, and by the way, taking countless human lives in the process. That's how we ended up with a 20-year war in Afghanistan, which we lost. The war in Afghanistan was many things. Military mistakes were surely made in Afghanistan. Policy mistakes were surely made in Afghanistan, but it was more than that. The war in Afghanistan was a constitutional failure. It was the breakdown of a system of checks and balances that was set up to prevent forever wars. And if we're not careful, if we don't ask more of our Congress, we can expect more and more and more of the same. I'll leave you with a very short story. In the 1830s, a 20-something-year-old French aristocrat traveled to America, spent 9 months touring the country, and then returned to France, where he wrote a book. The guy's name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and the book was Democracy in America, which today is one of the most famous works of political science ever. In the second volume of that book, Tocqueville wrote the following. He wrote, "There is no long war that does not put freedom at great risk in a democratic country. If it does not lead to despotism suddenly by violence, it leads to it mildly through habits." We are taught in America to watch out for our government, to keep it accountable, but really we only pay attention when something big and crazy and egregious happens. Let this story be a reminder to all of us to pay attention to the slow formation of bad habits too. I am 23 years old. America has been at war for practically my entire life. I, for one, am dedicating my life to making it stop. Thank you.